And now we have a little bit more understanding as far as the forced and mass migration, in which it explains the large density of African Americans who first settled in this area back at the origins of slavery, the origins of the Atlantic slave trade, but then over time continued to live here. Another forced migration was the Trail of Tears, which in the 1830s forced about 50,000 Native Americans who were living somewhere in the American Southeast in particular, and forced them to move to the beautiful state of Oklahoma. As the name implies, our next migration types is going to relate to large groups. And so later on, when I look at different immigration patterns in the United States, we're going to look at large groups over time. But in mass migration, for the most part, it's going to be voluntary. Now, there's some examples of forced and mass migrations. For example, the Atlantic slave trade, mass and forced migration. The Trail of Tears, forced and mass migration. The movement of Jews from Israel, a forced and mass migration. But there are definitely examples of voluntary mass migrations. The largest voluntary mass migration that happens, for the most part, every year is something called the Kumbh Mela. Kumbh space MELA. And this is of Hindu origin, so it occurs there in India. So like I said, about every 12 years is when the big one happens. But they have about every other year one of these large, massive pilgrimages for those members of the Hindu faith. And what they do is they all mass migrate to one particular area, and they essentially bathe in the holy waters of a particular river. And like I said, this changes, the location changes throughout time. This is by far the biggest mass migration we see. Hundreds of thousands of people at one time who will migrate to some place, and just all of a sudden, what will happen is all of a sudden you'll just have a pop-up city. They'll come out of nowhere as these migrants come to celebrate or for this pilgrimage for this particular religion that goes back all the way back about 2,000 years. So of course we see examples of lots of forced and mass migrations, but this one here is more involuntary, in which there is no choice. Another example of a mass migration is when the Brazilian government moved the capital from the green dot, Rio, to the yellow dot, Brasilia, with the idea they wanted to open up more of the population to the interior. And so much of the population of Brazil lives somewhere along the coast. They thought, well, let's open it up. This town, this area in the interior of the country of Brazil, let's get people to move there. And so it was kind of forced. Obviously, government played a key role, but over time, people voluntarily moved because it's the capital of Brazil, so it's attracted people. So it's as a way, and since they moved the capital to kind of spread out the population more and to increase inward investment within the country. Throughout much of the United States history, we've had this large western migration, this western expansion, but you could say, for example, the gold rush. So the gold rush, the simple way to remember whereabouts as far as the time when it occurred, the San Francisco 49ers are named because in 1849 was when the gold rush occurred. And so you saw a large mass migration for voluntary, so it wasn't forced, of people moving from the eastern part of the United States to the west. Another mass migration occurred during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. So the Dust Bowl that occurred there in New Mexico, Colorado, Oklahoma, essentially forced a lot of people to move. Most of them moved further out west. So essentially all the agricultural areas were just wiped out in the interior. And so you have famous books, The Grapes of Wrath and of Mice and Men, in which some of the plot, the setting, takes place related to this mass migration of people from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast. We've already detailed the forced and mass migration of Africans to the United States for slavery purposes, but after Civil War, when slavery was ended, you saw a mass migration that was voluntary of African Americans moving to the industrial north, represented by those arrows, but also those orange circles, which shows increasing population. And it makes sense. What was happening, the plantation south was collapsing, there was no jobs. Lots of the industry was thriving in the north. Further, if you were enslaved, if your generations were enslaved, you wouldn't want to stick around. So a lot of people were wanting to get the hell out of the South and move to the north. And so these various reasons caused the Great Migration. And I've mentioned earlier in the semester as far as how this dovetails with the changing location of African American music. African American music then essentially migrated to the north, and so we saw St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Harlem, all developing thriving music scenes, and that was subsequent, relatedly, subsequently related to the mass migration. We call this the first Great Migration of African Americans. And then after World War II, you saw another mass migration of African Americans. And so you saw continued migration from the South to the industrial North, but also more migration to the coast. A lot of that was participation in military, and so a lot of African Americans were now serving in bases throughout the West, throughout much of the country. And so when they came back after World War II, they decided to stay where those bases might have been located. Further, just more urban areas have been attractive as far as providing more jobs, providing more manufacturing jobs, more jobs in industry, especially from 1940 to 1970.